The crack of shattering glass cut through the warm hum of the Meridian Club like a gunshot, and every conversation in the room died at once. Nadia stood perfectly still at the edge of the private dining terrace, feeling the cold Merlot soaking through the thin white cotton of her uniform shirt, watching it spread dark and fast across her chest like a wound. The wine hadn't spilled. It had been thrown, hurled deliberately by the woman sitting across from her. The woman who was now pushing back her chair with a slow, theatrical scrape and rising to her full height in her ivory column dress, looking down at Nadia the way people look at something they've stepped in. "You got that on my shoes," Celeste Hargrove said it quietly, which was somehow worse than screaming. Nadia looked down. The heel of Celeste's satin pump had a single dark droplet on it. "I'm so sorry, Miss Hargrove. I'll get a cloth immediately. You walked into my elbow." Celeste's voice climbed a register, carrying now across the terrace to the surrounding tables, where Toronto's most powerful people had stopped eating to watch. "I've been coming to this club for 8 years, and I have never been treated with such carelessness." Hargrove, the tray slipped. "Don't." Celeste held up one hand. Her rings caught the candlelight. "You people always have an explanation." Nadia's jaw tightened. She was 26 years old, she had a biology degree she couldn't afford to use, and she was standing in front of 40 of the city's most influential people drenched in someone else's wine. She knew how this ended. Ian, the floor manager, was already speed-walking across the terrace with his clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield. What she didn't know, what no one in that room seemed prepared for, was that the man sitting at the table had been watching the entire thing. And he hadn't touched his drink once. She noticed him only because he was the only person in the room who wasn't staring at Celeste. He was staring at her. Stellan Vance was not a man who needed an introduction. If you lived in this city, you knew the name the same way you knew to look both ways before you crossed the road. Not because someone taught you, but because the alternative was too costly to contemplate. He was 34, the kind of architecture that belonged on the covers of business quarterlies and police files simultaneously. Dark wool suit, no tie, collar open, jaw like a cliff edge, eyes the precise grey of a January sky over Lake Ontario. He hadn't moved. Ian materialized at Nadia's elbow, breathing through his nose. "Nadia." Her name was a sentence, a termination notice wrapped in 2 syllables. "Why don't you head to the back? She stays." The voice came from the table. Ian's clipboard dropped an inch. He turned slowly, as if hoping the instruction would rearrange itself into something more manageable. "Mr. Vance." "I said she stays." Stellan Vance rose from his chair. He didn't hurry. He buttoned the single button of his jacket with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never, in his adult life, needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He walked around the table and stopped between Nadia and Celeste, close enough that Celeste had to take a small involuntary step back. "Celeste," he said her name, "the way you'd acknowledge a minor administrative error. You threw your wine at my server." Celeste laughed, bright and brittle. "I did no such thing." I gestured, and she was in the way. "Stellan, honestly, I was watching." He said it without inflection. "From the moment she arrived at the table, I was watching. You gestured with nothing in your hand. You picked up that glass specifically." The terrace was so quiet that Nadia could hear the fountain 3 floors below in the lobby atrium. Celeste's smile thinned. "You're embarrassing me. You came to my table, at my club, and you assaulted a member of staff in front of 40 witnesses." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm the least of your problems." Celeste looked at Nadia then, a long, assessing look, the kind that was meant to remind a person exactly how small they were. "She's a waitress." "Yes." He turned his back on Celeste and looked at Nadia directly for the first time. "And you're leaving." He said it to Celeste without looking at her again. "Ian will arrange a car." The silence that followed was geological. It had layers. It had history. Celeste Hargrove picked up her clutch from the table. She didn't say another word. She walked off the terrace with her back straight and her shoes clicking sharp against the stone, and the whole room exhaled in one long, collective breath. Ian looked like he wanted to evaporate. Stellan Vance turned back to Nadia. "You're bleeding." She touched the back of her hand without thinking. A shard from the broken glass had caught her there, a thin line, not deep, but bleeding steadily. She hadn't felt it until he said something. "It's nothing." She pressed her thumb against it. "I'll wrap it in the back. Come with me." He turned and walked toward the private corridor without checking whether she followed. Ian grabbed her sleeve in a panic. "Nadia, whatever you do, do not." She followed him. The private corridor behind the dining room was long and lined with the kind of art that cost more than her apartment building. Stellan led her to a small office at the end. Clearly his, from the way nothing in it was decorative. Just a desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over the illuminated skyline of the financial district. He went to the credenza along the wall, opened a drawer, and pulled out a first aid kit with the practiced ease of someone who kept one everywhere. "Sit," he said, pulling a chair around. "Mr. Vance, this really isn't necessary. You're dripping on the floor." He pulled out a gauze pad and antiseptic without looking up. "Sit down." She sat. He crouched in front of her and took her hand. His were warm, which surprised her. She'd expected cold. He cleaned the cut with the gauze, pressing steadily, not flinching when she did. He worked in silence for a moment and then said, without looking up, "How long have you been at the Meridian?" 8 months. Before that, St. Michael's, in the cafeteria. She didn't know why she was answering. And before that, the night shift at a 7-Eleven on Bloor. I have a habit of working multiple jobs. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. "Why?" She looked at him. "That's a personal question." "Yes." He applied a strip of tape across the gauze. "It is." He stood and briefly at the same height because she was still close to the chair. Close enough that she could see the small scar above his right eyebrow that no amount of tailoring or reputation could conceal. "Thank you," Nadia said carefully, "for what you did out there. You didn't have to, I know." He picked up the first aid kit and returned it to the drawer. "Ian will try to let you go tomorrow." She went still. "He'll manufacture a reason, documentation issue, customer complaint on file, something that can't be challenged." He turned back to face her, leaning against the credenza with his arms crossed. "Don't let him. I'm not sure I have a lot of leverage in that conversation. You do now." He held her gaze steadily. "If he moves to terminate you, you call this number." He picked up a card from the desk, heavy stock, just a number in navy ink, and held it out. Not to threaten anyone, just to make a phone call. Nadia took the card. She looked at it, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her for a moment. Genuinely looked, the way people usually tried to avoid when they didn't want to be accountable for what they found. "Because Celeste Hargrove has been doing things like that for 20 years. And nobody has ever looked at her the way you did when she said what she said." "How did I look at her? Like you were deciding whether she was worth the prison time?" Nadia almost laughed. Almost. He walked to the door and opened it. "Get that wrapped properly tonight. And eat something. You look like you've been running on coffee and adrenaline for about 6 days." She was fairly certain he was right. She hadn't slept properly since the call from the hospital. She walked back out into the corridor and made it 3 steps before she stopped, turned, and said, "How did you know about the multiple jobs? You knew before I told you." He paused in the doorway, and she could have sworn there was something careful in the way he said, "You carry your work shoes in a bag and change at the coat check. The bag is from St. Michael's Auxiliary. You've been doing this for a while." He closed the door. She stood in the corridor for a moment in her wine-stained shirt, with the card in her hand and a bandaged cut, and no idea at all what had just happened to her evening. She had a bus to catch. She had a brother waiting. She ran for the elevator. The apartment on Dufferin was the kind of place that real estate listings described as cozy and full of potential, which meant the kitchen window didn't fully seal, and the radiator made a sound like someone dragging furniture across the floor above every time the temperature dropped below 0. Nadia had lived there for 3 years. She had grown oddly fond of the radiator. Her brother was awake when she got home, which he wasn't supposed to be. Emmett was 19 and currently stretched out on the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees, a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the coffee table, and the particular kind of studied casualness that meant he'd heard her on the stairs and had been awake for hours. "It's midnight," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "I was just finishing something." He closed the laptop. He looked at the wine stain and then at her face and then said nothing, which was somehow the most adult thing he'd done in a while. Bad night. Manageable. She pulled off her coat and sat in the armchair across from him, tucking her feet up. The cut on her hand was starting to throb properly now. "How are you feeling?" Emmett had been diagnosed with a heart condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy 8 months ago, which was approximately 1 month before Nadia had taken the job at the Meridian. The medication cost what it cost, and the cardiologist at the University Health Network had used the phrase surgical intervention, twice now in a way that kept her awake at 3 a.m. with a calculator on her phone. "Good," he said. "I took the evening dose on time. I know. I check the reminder app." He made a face. "You check the reminder app?" "Every day." She met his eyes. "Don't be weird about it." He flopped back against the couch cushions with the theatrical exhaustion of someone who wanted to argue but had decided against it. "The clinic called today," he said more quietly, "about the consult, the one Dr. Osei mentioned. Nadia Osei was Emmett's cardiologist, and currently the person Nadia thought about most in the world. And they have a slot in 3 weeks." He paused. "The surgical team consult, the one for the—" "I know which one. Nadia." He sat up and looked at her the way he did when he was trying to be older than he was. "It's okay if we can't." "We can." She said it before she knew it was true. She said it the same way she always did, the way their mother had taught them, which was that you said it first and then you figured out how to make it true. "We absolutely can. Don't think about the cost." Emmett looked at her for a long time. He was smart in a way that sometimes made her sad, because he had been forced to grow up fast enough to see the seams in her reassurances. "Okay," he said finally, and she loved him so much it was almost physical. "Go to sleep," she said. "You should sleep first, you look terrible." "Thank you, good night." She waited until his bedroom door closed before she took the business card out of her coat pocket and set it on the kitchen table. She stared at it for a while. Just a number, no name, no title. The kind of card that implied the bearer had no need to explain themselves. Then she took out her phone and opened her banking app, which she immediately closed again because some information was not useful at midnight. She made tea she didn't drink, standing at the kitchen window watching the streetlights on Dufferin, and eventually she went to bed and did not sleep for a very long time. Ian summoned her to his office at 10 a.m. the next day, which was her day off, which told her everything she needed to know about how the conversation was going to go. She sat across from him and watched him shuffle papers in the particular way that people shuffle papers when they know the papers aren't actually the point. "We've had a complaint," Ian began, in writing, "from Ms. Hargrove's office, filed this morning." He looked up. "Pardon?" "The complaint. It was filed this morning, so sometime between last night and now." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'd like to know what it says." Ian's composure flickered. "It outlines your conduct during last night's sin." "Ian," she kept her voice even, "before this goes any further, I want you to know that Mr. Vance gave me a number to call. He told me to call it if this conversation happened. I'd prefer not to call it, because I'd rather sort this out between us. But I will if I have to." Ian set down the papers. He looked at her, really looked, with the expression of someone reassessing a situation they thought they had entirely mapped out. He cleared his throat. "There's no formal process underway. Good, the complaint has been noted and filed. Also fine. You're on shift Thursday." He picked up the papers again and shuffled them back into meaninglessness. "That's all I needed to discuss." She stood, nodded, and left. She made it to the elevator before her hands started shaking. That afternoon, a car pulled up outside her building. It was black and understated, not a limousine, nothing theatrical, but it had the quality of a vehicle that had been chosen for reasons other than fuel efficiency. The driver was a woman, which Nadia hadn't expected, with close-cropped silver hair and the bearing of someone who had made a career of seeing things and not remarking on them. "Miss Corrigan," the driver said. Nadia stood on the front step of her building with her grocery bag and her coat half-buttoned. "Yes?" "Mr. Vance would like to meet with you if you're available." Nadia looked at the car, she looked at the driver. She thought about the cut on her hand and the card on her kitchen table, and the number she had called Ian's bluff with this morning, without actually dialing it. Did he say what it's about? "He said to tell you, it's about the thing you're not sleeping over." She put her groceries inside and got in the car. The Vance Group's offices were in a tower on Bay Street that she had walked past approximately 400 times without ever considering what happened inside. The reception floor was the temperature of a place that didn't have to justify its electricity bill. Everything was the color of dark water, charcoal, slate, the particular blue-gray of deep lake ice. She was brought up to the 43rd floor in an elevator that moved without sensation, and when the doors opened, she walked directly into a room that was mostly glass and mostly sky. Stellan Vance was on the phone when she entered, speaking in what she recognized after a moment as French, Quebecois, fluid and efficient. He gestured to the chair across from his desk without interrupting himself. She sat. She didn't look at the view, because she suspected that looking at the view was how people lost their bearings in this room. He finished the call and set the phone down. "You kept Ian's job for him," he said. "That was generous." "I kept my job," she said. "That's different." Something in his expression acknowledged that she was correct. "Do you want coffee?" He stood and walked to the window, not to look out at it, she realized, but to think. It was a habit. "I know about Emmett," he said, "about the cardiomyopathy, about the surgical consultation. The air went out of her lungs. How?" "Celeste Hargrove's family owns the clinic where Dr. O.C. practices." He said it plainly, which was somehow worse than if he'd tried to soften it. When Celeste decides she dislikes someone, she has a tendency to find pressure points. Nadia went cold all the way through. She can't. She's already made a call. He turned to look at her. "Emmet's consultation has been moved to a waiting list indefinitely." The room tilted slightly. She gripped the arms of the chair. She thought about Emmett on the couch last night saying it's okay if we can't, and she thought about the way he'd looked at her with those two old eyes, and she thought about the calculator app at 3 a.m., and all of it compressed into a single pinpoint of cold fury behind her sternum. She did that, Nadia said, because of one dinner service. She did that because I intervened. His voice was careful, even, which means this is, to a degree, my problem to resolve. I don't need you to. The Hargroves, he said, continuing as though she hadn't spoken, have been a complication in several of my dealings for approximately 2 years. Celeste's father controls 3 seats on a planning board that has been blocking a development project of mine in the East End. I have been looking for leverage. He paused. Celeste has now handed me some. Nadia stared at him. By attacking a waitress. By attacking a waitress in front of 40 witnesses, half of whom have already spoken to people this morning. A trace of something crossed his face. Not satisfaction, exactly, but the recognition of a pattern completing itself. But it creates a problem for you in the short term, and in the short term, I can help. In exchange for what? She said it flatly, because she was not going to sit in a chair on the 43rd floor of a Bay Street tower and pretend to be surprised that powerful men operated on the basis of exchange. He sat down behind the desk. He opened a folder. I need someone to accompany me to 3 events over the next 6 weeks. The Alderton Foundation Gala, the Voss Industries AGM dinner, and a weekend at a private retreat in Muskoka, where 3 of the 4 people I need in the same room without their lawyers will be present. He slid a document across the desk. It was 1 page, which made her trust it more than 20 would have. Publicly, you would be presented as someone I'm seeing. Privately, you would have complete autonomy. Separate accommodation at every event. A contract stipulating exactly what is and isn't required. He paused, and Emmett's consultation would be rescheduled through a different clinic, one with no Hargrove affiliation, within the week, privately funded, privately managed, and not contingent on anything going forward. Nadia looked at the document. She looked at him. Why me? He answered without hesitating. Because the people I'm trying to maneuver have known every woman in my social circle for years. They'll read a familiar face the same way they read a chess piece. They'll already know which moves I'm making. He leaned forward slightly. You are someone they've never seen before. You have no history in these circles. You have no performance to maintain. That makes you harder to read. I'm a waitress from Dufferin Street. You're a woman with a biology degree who is working 3 jobs because she's spending every spare dollar on her brother's medical care, who told Ian where to file his paperwork this morning using nothing but a bluff and a business card. He held her gaze. You're not hard to read because you're simple. You're hard to read because you're focused on something else entirely. She was quiet for a long moment. He needs the consultation, she said finally, not as an argument, just as a fact that required acknowledgement. He'll have it regardless, Stellan said. I'll make the call this afternoon. That's not the trade. That's the correction of something I should have anticipated. He tapped the document once, lightly. The trade is what comes after. She looked at the paper again. It was written in plain language. No conditionals that ran to the bottom of the page, no clauses folded inside other clauses. Either that meant he was honest or it meant he was sophisticated enough that the real terms were somewhere she wouldn't think to look. She read it twice and didn't find anything she'd call a trap. She thought about Emmett saying it's okay if we can't, and she thought about the waiting list, and she thought about the radiator on Dufferin making its furniture-dragging sound, and she thought about the way Stellan Vance had looked at her last night. Not through her, not past her, but at her, the way people didn't. 3 events, she said. 3 events, and separate accommodation. At every location. In writing, as you can see. She picked up the pen he hadn't offered but had left within reach, and she signed on the line at the bottom, and she thought, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Which was different, she noted, from being wrong. The first event was the Alderton Foundation Gala, held at the Royal Ontario Museum, which Nadia had last visited on a grade 7 field trip, and which was, it turned out, considerably more intimidating when you arrived in a car that smelled like leather conditioning and were wearing something that cost more than her month's rent. Stellan's assistant, an efficient woman named Darla, who communicated primarily through scheduling software, had arranged everything with the brisk benevolence of someone who understood that Nadia's wardrobe was a structural problem to be solved and not a character flaw to be noted. Stellan met her in the lobby. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way he had, that assessing, non-intrusive look that somehow still reached all the way through. You look like you're preparing for a deposition, he said. Is that bad? Not for tonight. Half the room is preparing for a deposition. He offered his arm. Ready? No, she said honestly, and took his arm. The room was everything she expected and a few things she hadn't. The guest list was the kind of cross-section that only existed in Toronto at a certain price point. Old money and new money, in careful, watchful proximity, politicians being photographed beside artists, being photographed beside people who owned things that most people had never heard of. The art in the background was, fittingly, very large and very expensive and not entirely comfortable to look at. Stellan moved through it with the ease of someone who had stopped being impressed by rooms decades ago. He introduced her to people whose names she recognized from building facades and quarterly reports, and she shook hands and said measured, careful things, and noticed, almost despite herself, that he always angled slightly toward her when someone was speaking, the way people do when they're listening for the answer to something. After 40 minutes, they found a quieter corner near a Henry Moore sculpture that was taller than both of them, and Stellan handed her a glass of sparkling water without being asked. "The grey-haired man by the installation," he said, not looking in that direction. "Aldous Hartley. He controls the Eastern Planning Board. He's been speaking to Celeste's father twice a week for 2 months. Nadia looked in the direction he wasn't looking. Aldous Hartley was in his 60s, heavyset, with the particular ease of someone who had been comfortable in rooms like this since before it became fashionable. He was watching them. "He's watching us," she said. "He's been watching us since we came in." Stellan lifted his glass and said without looking at her, "Laugh, like I said something funny." She laughed. She made it reach her eyes, which took a second of deliberate effort. She heard, distinctly, the recalibration in his next breath. "You're good at that," he said quietly. "I worked the lunch shift at a sports bar on King Street for 2 years," she said. "You learn to control your face." He looked at her then, and there was something in it. Not surprise exactly, but the quality of someone who had made a calculation and found it was more interesting than they'd expected. "Hartley is going to come over," he said, "in about 4 minutes. He's going to be charming, and he's going to ask about the Queensway project, and he's going to be watching you for how much you know." "How much do I know?" "Nothing," his voice was even. "And that's exactly right." Aldous Hartley came over in 3.5 minutes. He was, as promised, charming, the kind of charming that had been professionally maintained for decades, polished to a surface that reflected everything and revealed nothing. He shook Stellan's hand with the ease of long acquaintance and turned to Nadia with the studied warmth of a man who made everyone he met feel like the center of something. "And who is this?" he said. "Nadia Corrigan," she said. "I'm a biologist. Mostly I try to keep my brother from eating cereal at midnight." Hartley laughed, genuine, surprised, unguarded. Stellan's hand shifted at the small of her back, barely perceptible, but she felt the lightest pressure, something like acknowledgement. Later, in the car on the way back to Dufferin, neither of them spoke for a while. "Hartley wants a meeting," Stellan said eventually. "You're welcome," she said, looking out the window at the city sliding past. She heard him almost laugh, which she counted. She got home after midnight and sat at the kitchen table in the dress that cost more than her rent and the heels she'd managed to survive in for 4.5 hours. And she called the hospital because they had left a message about Emmett's rescheduled consultation. And she sat there with her hand pressed over her mouth for a long moment after the call ended, because it was real, it was booked, it was next Thursday at 9 a.m. at a clinic in Forest Hill, and someone had already handled the referral. Emmett appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks, squinting at her. "Why are you crying in a gown at 1 in the morning?" "I'm not crying," she said, which was mostly true in the technical sense. He padded over and sat across from her, and she told him about the consultation, and he went very still the way he did when something mattered too much for his face to contain it. Then he said, "Who arranged this?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Someone who owed me something," she said. Emmett looked at her for a long time with those eyes that had been 25 since he was 15. "Nadia, he's not." She stopped. "It's fine. It's a business arrangement." 6 weeks. "Does he know that?" Emmett asked. "Does he know it's fine?" She didn't have a good answer to that, which she chose to interpret as tiredness rather than anything else. The retreat in Muskoka was the third event, the last one, the one that was supposed to be 2 nights in a rented compound on the lake, with people who had complicated relationships to zoning regulations and infrastructure contracts. What it actually was, by the second evening, was a situation that had gone sideways in a direction Stellan told her afterward he hadn't entirely anticipated, though she suspected he had anticipated it at least a little, because the 4 people who needed to be in the same room without their lawyers were in the same room, and the conversation had been going for 2 hours, and Nadia had been sitting at the end of the table with a glass of water and no particular role except existing. And then Aldous Hartley had said something about the community consultation process and how the real obstacle was public trust. And Nadia had said, quietly, The consultation wasn't announced until 3 days before it closed. The room went quiet. Stellan looked at her. It wasn't a warning look, it was the other kind. "Pardon?" Hartley said. "The consultation for the Eastern Corridor project." She kept her voice conversational the way she'd kept it conversational through 2 years of lunch shifts and 8 months at the Meridian. The public notice period was 72 hours. Posted at a community center in a neighborhood with 40% newcomer population and no English-language community paper. She set down her water glass. People didn't disengage from the process. They didn't know there was one. The silence stretched. One of the other 3 people at the table, a woman from the municipal planning office, whose name was Brenna Halcott, said, "That's a fair characterization." After that, the conversation went differently. Driving back down the highway toward the city, with the trees on either side going dark and the lake long behind them, Stellan said, "You looked up the consultation records. I had 6 weeks," she said. "I read a lot." He was quiet for a moment. "That wasn't in the contract, no." She looked out the window. It wasn't. Another silence, different from the early ones. "The development," he said. "If it gets approved, it'll include a community health center. I was going to mention that. I should have led with it." "You should have," she agreed. "I'm telling you now." "I know." The highway ran straight and dark ahead of them, and the city lights were just beginning to blur the horizon, and Nadia thought about Emmett's consultation report, sitting on the kitchen table with 3 dense pages of medical language she'd spent a week translating into something she could act on. And she thought about 6 weeks that were officially over, as of tonight, and she thought about Stellan Vance looking at her at the gala with the particular quality of someone reassessing an estimate they thought they had correct. "The contract's done," she said. "Not a question." "It is." She nodded. She wasn't going to make it strange. "There's a project," Stellan said, after a moment that had been doing a lot of work, separate from all of this. "A community liaison position. For the development, if it gets approved. It would involve actual biology as it happens, environmental impact oversight, and it would involve talking to people in a room without flinching." He glanced at her sideways. "I can think of someone who's demonstrated a reasonable aptitude for both." Nadia looked at him. "You're offering me a job. I'm describing a job that exists." He kept his eyes on the road. "What you do with that information is your own business." She looked back at the highway. She thought about the radiator on Dufferin. She thought about Emmett in his socks at the kitchen table. She thought about the way Stellan had put his hand at the small of her back for one brief second, in a room full of people who were watching for exactly that kind of signal, and the way it had felt like something she hadn't been warned about. "I'd want full terms in writing," she said. "Obviously." He almost smiled. She was getting better at catching the edge of it. "And I'd want to negotiate the scope of the environmental oversight myself, without you in the room. Actually, and..." She stopped. She pressed her thumbnail against the door handle, just to feel something grounded. "And I'm not easy to manage," she said. "In case that hasn't been clear, Nadia." He said her name the same way he said everything, like it was the exact right word in the exact right place. "The thing I find most difficult to manage is people who don't mean what they say." He glanced at her. "You mean every single thing you say. That is not a problem I need to solve." She looked out at the city lights growing closer, and she thought, 6 weeks ago I was standing in a wine-soaked uniform on a terrace in front of 40 strangers, and I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to me. She still didn't, not entirely. But the highway was lit ahead of them, and Emmett had an appointment on Thursday, and somewhere in the distance the city was doing what it always did, holding everything at once, the impossible and the ordinary, side by side. And Nadia Corrigan decided that not knowing for once was not the same as being lost.